I think right now people probably care more about wildlife and a healthy planet than possibly ever before in the history of mankind. Mm-hmm. And that does give me hope. I think where people tend to where people tend to fail is whenever it comes down to like personal sacrifice. Mm-hmm. I know myself, like I could be a lot better at a lot of things and I'm not. But everybody wants there to be, healthy rivers and healthy ecosystems and lots of wildlife. Like nobody doesn't want that. And that does give me hope. I think that for, some of the big magnificent species, those I hope are always gonna be around. Like it's pretty hard to like watch an animal like an ocelot just blink out from the United States. Like people are going to rally around that. But I think that the scarier thing is the animals that are more ecosystem dependent, in which it's really hard to figure out how to like continue for them to have an existence.
I don't know about you, but I always carry a knife. It doesn't matter what the situation is, I'm always reaching for a blade. Whether I'm out hunting in the backwoods, fishing on lakes and rivers, or simply cutting rope at camp. And when I need a tool, I want something that's quality, durable, and handmade right here in the USA. I know that's something you're looking for as well, so go to MaloneKnives.com and get yourself something that's going to last and look damn good too. I'm a huge fanatic for handmade, high-quality leather and canvas products. In my opinion, they last longer, hold up better to the abuses of travel, and honestly, they just look really cool. That's why I use Badger Claw Outfitters. They've been making handcrafted products for hunting, camping, and travel since 2011, and that's right up my alley. Best part is they're made right here in the USA and are guaranteed for life. They've got everything from gun leather, belts, custom knife sheaths, wallets, duffel bags, leather and canvas pouches, everyday carry items, and more. Badger Claw Outfitters, made in the USA, built for the wild. This is the Aptitude Outdoors podcast, where we interview conservationists, hunters, anglers, and outdoorsmen and women to bring you the greatest stories, information, and advice from the best in the world. All right, everybody, welcome back to the Aptitude Outdoors podcast. Thanks for tuning back in. Today, our special guest is Ben Masters. He's a filmmaker. He's an author. He studied wildlife biology at Texas A&M. He's an adventurer. He's an explorer. You name it, Ben has done it. And he's made a great film recently called Deep in the Heart. If you haven't watched that yet, I highly recommend it. He also has other films out there, wildlife conservation films, The River and the Wall, Unbranded, all great films. Go check them out. And I hope you enjoy our awesome conversation about conservation. Say that 10 times fast. First things first, man, I have this sense that you're an explorer. Like, you just have this inherent need to just like go do stuff and figure stuff out. I mean, in one of your films, you're exploring the whole Rio Grande River, essentially the border wall all across the southern Texas. And like, you're in it. You're not just behind the camera like, oh, this is cool and all, but you're like in the thick of it. Where did that sense of exploration come from? Because that's not something everyone has. Like, a lot of people are content staying home, watching stuff on TV, and then there's people that have to be in it.
I think that it kind of came from not having that as a kid. I grew up in Amarillo and had the wonderful good fortune to have I had two parents that, loved to be outside, and we had a place that we ranched on east of town, about 60 miles or so, and spent a lot of my childhood, on a couple hundred acres. Did a lot of fishing, did a lot of hunting. And I went on a backpacking trip whenever I was 16 in southern Colorado near Creed. And it was my first time to really do backcountry, public land type of trip. and I did it with my brother and my sister, and we hit it right in the middle of this huge snowstorm, or not a big rainstorm. It was just like cold and miserable hypothermia weather for 5 days. But on the last day, the sun broke out of the clouds, and we got to like dry ourselves off, and we went fishing. And I just remember being 16 and looking at this map and seeing that we had gone just this tiny distance. You know, we'd only gone like, 20 or so miles cumulative, and there was this huge swath of public lands that you can just go do whatever you want to on it. I mean, literally more country than you could see in a lifetime. And that was a really instrumental trip in my life that just got me hooked on the fact that there's still a bunch of big open spaces that you can go, tromp around on. And that led to doing a bunch of pack trips and horse pack trips during my college years. And then we did a big cross country horseback trip in 2010, another one in 2013. And, did a big river trip along the Rio Grande from headwaters out to the sea, or at least the Texas section of it. And yeah, I do a lot of pack trips to this day, pretty much all summer. And yeah, that's when I'm happiest, is out there seeing some new country.
Yeah. And I mean, making films has to be stressful, and especially like wildlife films. Like wildlife just does their thing, man. They're not complacent, just sitting around and easy to catch it or catch on film, and they don't do well in an interview scenario. So what's that like? I mean, how do you go about finding this, especially the incredibly rare wildlife? I'm assuming you work with like biologists, naturalists that really know where this stuff is, and then on the filming side, that's like a whole different element. I mean, some animals are nocturnal, some animals here only come out at certain hours a day, certain times a year. So what's that process like? I mean, you've done that in a lot of films and a lot of stuff. You got a lot of wildlife footage. So how does that work in your world?
Yeah, so I think, just for some random person out there, I've got a film company called Fin and Fur Films. We've done 3 features in the last 8 years or so, and then do handful of short films each year, all wildlife, adventure, conservation focused. And obviously film and wildlife is one of the most important aspects of our job. And each species is different. They all have their different challenges. Some of them, you can show up in a day and film an entire sequence, like a blind catfish that's in a tank type setting. And it's more along the lines of, setting up a shot that looks like the aquifer in which they live, and then, showing them and what is to be representative of where they live, versus other, shoots like ocelots. We filmed ocelots for 10 months for Deep in the Heart. And it was just this waiting game, a patience game of camera trapping to get, these behaviors that are not just like, oh, cool, look, it's an animal, but it's like, that is an animal that's doing something, and you can kind of enter into its space and live its life a little bit and live in the brush. So every species that you film is different, and we rely very heavily on, different ranchers that see something on the property. It's like, hey, we've got a bunch of birds, or like we did a big Roadrunner story 2 years ago. It was just a buddy of mine that manages a ranch was like, hey, I got a Roadrunner nest in my backyard. Do you want to film it? And I'm like, yep, I'll be there later today. Or, these different organizations that know where the desert sheep are, or where the mountain lions are, or where the ocelots are, and just kind of working with them and using their knowledge base to have a starting point and where to find them. And then once you find them, then you can kind of figure out how can we try to get some behaviors and actually make a storyline out of it.
Yeah, I remember I was thinking about this last night. I was rewatching Deep in the Heart, and I remember doing a report on ocelots in 6th grade, man, and it stuck with me all these years. And when I saw them in the film, I was like, this is the coolest thing ever, because they're I don't even think most people outside of maybe Texas or in like conservation circles even know about ocelots. Like, they're just like pretty much on like very limited populations and stuff, which you highlight in the film as well. So what's the plight of the ocelot? Because they're like a very cool animal. They're like the leopard of house cats. They're just such cool animals, man.
Yeah, ocelots are fucking rad. Ocelots is a species that we featured on in Deep in the Heart, which is our, natural history film that we made with Matthew McConaughey that released in June of last year. But ocelots are historically, they're one of the geographically most widespread cats. They extend all the way from Texas through Mexico, through Central America, and down into South America, into, Chile and kind of where it starts getting cold again. But they just like thick brush. They like thick brush. They like a tree cover. They like a canopy. They like jungle type of environments. So historically in the United States, we had ocelots from East Texas into Louisiana, Arkansas, through a lot of our major river bottoms that were, thick hardwoods, bottomwood forests, any really thick spots, all the way down into Mexico. And due to a handful of different factors, one, we had a very extensive poisoning program in the 30s and 40s trying to kill off all of our coyotes. There was a lot of trapping. There wasn't really research being done on how ocelots were doing. But the species just slowly lost all of its range until the 1970s, when we actually thought it had been extirpated. Some people thought they were gone. And there was a fellow by the name of Dr. Michael Tuez, who at that point in time was just a graduate student, and he ended up trapping one. And he caught an ocelot, which was this big momentous thing to happen, and then has since dedicated his entire life into understanding the species. And that's who we got to use as our consultant for the ocelot filming. But what pretty much has happened is their geographic range, habitat loss, poison, so on and so forth. Right now, there's two populations. One of the populations is on Laguna Atascosa National Wildlife Refuge. There's probably about 20 cats in there. And then further north of there, near Port Manfield, and then going due northwest, there's a population on a handful of different ranches, all of them working cattle ranches, and they've just got a bunch of really thick brush, and the ocelots are doing very well there. There's probably somewhere in the ballpark between like 75 and 100 on those private ranches that we know of. There's probably more ranches that have ocelots that we aren't aware of, but that could be out there. So critically endangered, we've got 100 to 150 of them, maybe. And one of the things that I'd like to see in my lifetime that I really think has likelihood is to see some ocelots or ocelot genetics from Mexico being infused into our population here, so that, they'll be healthier. And then also the establishment of new populations elsewhere in Texas in their historic range. Because we've got a bunch of really good bush country. We've got a bunch of, hardwood river bottoms and forests that have regrown over the past 100 years. And then also, I think just our societal view of wildlife, people want wildlife these days. And we want a success story. And I think ocelot reintroductions and recovery is one of the greatest opportunities that we have in Texas to, prove that we can do great things.
So you studied wildlife biology, and that's pretty apparent in a lot of the stuff that you do. But how did what made that leap from wanting to be like a biologist maybe to becoming a filmmaker? Because a lot of people that I know that make wildlife documentaries have that wildlife biology background. And I think it's awesome because you have a deeper understanding than someone just kind of coming in and wanting to make a film about whatever animal. You have a deep biological, ecological understanding. So where did that leap come for you?
I studied wildlife at Texas A&M for 4 years, and then I graduated and was part of a film called Unbranded that had a couple of my classmates. We adopted these wild Mustangs and then trained them and then rode them from Mexico to Canada through Arizona, Utah, Idaho, Wyoming, and Montana. And it was a film about wild horse adoptions, about public lands in the West, and about this conundrum of what do we do with all these excess horses. And the film did quite well. It's a feature-length film, and Fair warning to the adventurous listeners out there, it may make you want to quit your job and go adopt a horse and take off for 6 months. But seeing the impact of that movie really solidified my career path of going down the film route. We were able to get probably over 500 horses adopted. We had a screening at the Department of the Interior, had the Secretary of the Interior there watching it, had all these different folks from the Bureau of Land Management there. I was able to sit on a Bureau of Land Management's Wild Horse and Burro Advisory Board. And I think that, coming from making that film did more of an impact than the research. And I think that the research, like wildlife research, is so incredibly important. Mm-hmm. Like unbiased, good research in science is so incredibly important. But I think also storytelling is very important, and it's hard to decide exactly how important it is. It's difficult to quantify the impacts of a film. But after seeing all those horses get adopted, I decided to go into the film route and started making a lot of short films to learn how to do it. And then since then, I've directed 2 feature films. And then now we've gotten into this genre called blue chip natural history filmmaking, which is, the narrator and then the wildlife behavior that's on screen. That's what I love to do, man. I get to spend a lot of my year, getting to see some of the most remarkable animals and their behaviors out there and researching them and getting to nerd out about all these issues. It's a really cool lifestyle, and I've been able to put together this really awesome team that I get to work with. And not a day goes by that we're not super grateful for what we get to do. And hopefully we get to do it for a long time to come.
Well, yeah, I think you brought up an important point. Like all the research is super important to understand what's happening, but like you get to make people feel emotional about that research. And I think that at the end of the day is really more important, because the average person doesn't care about research. They care about how they feel about wildlife and stuff. So, I mean, wildlife films, that's like the only thing I watch is like documentaries and wildlife film, because that's what I'm into. That's what I love. I don't really go to the movies and watch stuff unless my wife wants to go or something. So that's like my whole world. And I've gone down that path a little bit too. It's like I can talk about it all day and share facts, but at the end of the day, people want to why does it matter to them? I think diving down conservation too is like what I really love. And I didn't realize until the last few years how entwined it is with political agendas and policy, and like conservation laws and things, as you've stated in a couple of films, aren't always tied to scientific backed things. It's also tied to emotions sometimes. Like there's been a couple instances last year where things got passed that weren't backed by any science. So how do people rectify that in the policy making and stuff? Or is it just like it's so political, conservation, and you like the river and the wall, that's like a hugely political topic and it affects so much wildlife. How do you try and get people to realize that that's a connection other than just bickering about red, blue, whatever and stuff? Because conservation is bipartisan. There's no way about it. It has to be, or it's not going to go anywhere.
Yeah, I think that, with our films, there's certainly some advocacy involved in it, but we definitely don't try to demonize or, point fingers or add to that, polarization that we see often in today's society. And I think that it's a lot easier to do that in a film than it is on social media, because somebody who sits down to watch a 70-minute movie enters into it with a much different mind space than they do sitting down to scroll through Instagram, where the algorithm selects for, the biggest trolls and the ugliest voices and the nastiest comments. So I think that, the doc space and the wildlife space is a good place to explore some of these more nuanced topics of, immigration and a border wall, and to recognize that we have a huge problem with our immigration system in the United States. Everybody agrees with that. There is not a single person that is happy with what the current status quo is. And then to do this big exploration of how would an actual physical 20-foot high structure built along the U.S.-Mexico border impact not only that immigration system, but also wildlife dispersals and border patrol response time? And is there alternatives that can be used to achieve the intended goal without having that, really big impact on wildlife and private property rights? And, I like to think that our films are pretty nuanced and respectful. We certainly try to make them that way. Sometimes we definitely lean into some advocacy stuff for things that we truly believe should be changed. But I do think it's important that people, realize that, and I, maybe I'm a minority, but I don't think the world is nearly as polarized as people make it out to be.
Yeah.
You see that happen all the time with wildlife policy. You'll have some issues with the really controversial stuff that tends to make press, but every day there's wildlife agencies and state departments working with all sorts of different NGOs and philanthropists and boots on the ground, finding common ground with landowners and different stakeholders and doing really, really phenomenal and important work. They just don't get the press headlines like, wolves eating somebody's cows or these bigger topics get. And I think that's a shame, because there are so many successes that we should exalt and be proud of that oftentimes don't get the same notoriety or applause or just media coverage as some of the more controversial things.
I was asked recently, what does the outdoors mean to you? To me, the outdoors is everything. It's like the growth model that consumes the entrepreneur, or the unending drive that pushes the athlete to outperform the competition. It's the greatest teacher of life lessons, whether it be learning to accept that most things are out of your control, or that the trees, the rivers, the mountains move along whether you're there or not. It's the motivator that keeps me accountable to my physical and mental health, because if I don't have the strength and conditioning to do the things that I enjoy outdoors, whether they be hunting, fishing, backpacking, adventure racing, or tackling some long distance adventures, then everything becomes exponentially more difficult. Most importantly, the outdoors allows me to be, to think, to exist in the same plane that the majority of the natural world still exists in, to break the bonds from what we call civilization. The outdoors is freedom, a place where life and death are one and the same, the prime example of what it means to exist. In my mind, there's no separation. The outdoors simply is, as all things should be, perfection in its most chaotic form. The outdoors is you, it's me, it's all of us. Of the stuff that I've watched of yours, a lot of stuff focuses around water, because that's such a massive issue for everyone, both humans and wildlife. And I think the vibe I'm getting is overuse is a big problem everywhere, especially in the Southwest. I mean, if anybody's read Cadillac Desert or anything like that, it's like the whole thing around water affects everyone, because it's like a huge political issue. It's a huge wildlife issue. Is that intentional, or is that just stating facts about, like what's going on out there? Because like you, Deep in the Heart, you mentioned huge aquifers of Texas and like how stuff is drying up and rivers are going dry and stuff like that, and how it's negatively impacting everyone. So the water issue is huge everywhere. I mean, even up here in the Great Lakes region I live in, water is a huge issue, and we have more water than we know what to do with,
Yeah, I mean, I think a lot of we're actually creating a feature film on water right now. And it is a huge issue, because, you have a couple things that revolve around it. One is just like the ability for humans to exist.
Yeah.
And, if you take a look at the frailty of Texas's water supply, and you look at our population growth of going from 30 million to 50 million people, which is projected over the next 30 years, And then you look at the history of some of the precipitation that we've had. If we got hit by a drought like what they experienced in the 1950s, we wouldn't have enough water. Mm-hmm. And, historically, we've had this amazing bank of water that was our security, which was aquifers. And, that water, which is hundreds or thousands of years old, that's just sitting there that we can use. And we've lost a lot of our aquifers. And many of those aquifers have been pumped to the extent where they're lower than the surface of the earth now, so that they're not supplying the springs anymore that, mm-hmm. were the headwaters of our rivers. So it's a huge issue for just like the ability for humanity to exist. But from a biological perspective, from a wildlife perspective, you've got these rivers that have flown for, hundreds of thousands, millions of years. And you have species that have adapted to live in that specific river. And you end up finding a lot of endemism, a lot of unique species that are found nowhere else inside of these different river sheds, especially in Texas, because our state is geographically is in a way where we have 12 unique watersheds that all terminate in the coast. So there's not a lot of shared waterways between the two, which means that we have just this remarkable array of endemic species. And whenever you turn off the tap to those rivers, whether that's from aquifer overpumping that kills the springs or overuse along the reservoirs, you end up threatening some of these animals that have been living here for, hundreds of thousands of years. And I think that should be a pretty serious concern for people who live here, of like, if an ecosystem is so degraded that an animal that's been living here for millions of years can't make a living anymore, like, we should be concerned about that, not just for that animal's sake, but for just like the health of the river in which, our cities depend upon and our bays and estuaries depend upon. It's kind of like a canary in the coal mine for our own well-being.
Yeah. And one of the things that you really highlight that I don't think a lot of people are familiar with is the amount of species, even species that are so common today that you'd never think about it, such as like white-tailed deer being extirpated from a state. Essentially, up here in Ohio, they were extirpated. They didn't come back until like the mid-70s or something like that. Wow. They were like gone. Nobody, like my dad's generation, basically didn't get to, or maybe have been like the first people to hunt deer in decades because they were extirpated. And down in Texas, it sounded like it was a pretty similar scenario. How do you think that like, that's a huge conservation success story first, but how do you think that like that comes about? Because is it people realizing that like, oh man, we really screwed up and these animals are gone and we need to fix this? Or is it just like a natural progression with the broadening of knowledge and people have more access to knowledge nowadays? I don't know how that works out usually at the end.
Well, I think that the reintroduction of animals across North America was certainly not an accident. That was the dedicated lifetimes of hundreds of people and philanthropists and grants and government programs, and just a massive effort at a societal level that all looked at this as like, hey, it is not right to get rid of an entire species from its range. It's wrong. Like, we should not do that. Extinction is not okay. Mm-hmm. How can we bring these things back? And I think one of the reasons why we really showed those in Deep in the Heart is to show that like you can do that. I mean, bison is a great example. I mean, in Texas, we've gone from fewer than a dozen bison to tens of thousands over the course of 110 years. And, that number continues to climb. Same thing with white-tailed deer. Like, we can do this. Some species, it's easier than others, especially, the charismatic ones that are profitable, like deer. But there's also, endangered species that have also made remarkable comebacks too. Bald eagle is a great example. But I think with our films, I really try to show a lot of that success, because I think it's really important to recognize, like, if we want more ocelots in Texas, we can have more ocelots in Texas. That is totally achievable. The only reasons not to do it is because, cowards in leadership position or government red tape or just like fears that don't even exist. But, we can certainly do it. The science is there. The research is there. The landscape is there. It's just a matter of getting it done.
And that's what blew me away when you're talking about like mountain lions, cougars, whatever you want to call them. And there's like, when you said there's like no management at all for these down in Texas, that just blew my mind because like, I don't know. There's no limits, no, like I've never heard of anything. The only thing we have up here would be like coyotes, I guess, would be the only equivalent. And they're not really doing as much damage as I think people are saying as well. I mean, they do some damage, but that just totally blew my mind because they're already a species that's like gets just hounded on like continually, like cougars and stuff like that. So why? That's my question. Like, where does that make sense at all? I like no regulation. Like hogs are overpopulated in Texas. They're invasive and all this stuff. That makes sense. But like cats, big cats, that just blows my mind. Absolutely.
Yeah, me too. And I think, it's time for Texas to begin a program where we do monitor and manage our mountain lions. I think that the reason why that's happened is just Texas is a unique state. It's got a lot of private lands. We have some phenomenal land stewards that live here. And I think that's, a real testament to private land stewardship that, we still have mountain lions here despite a lack of government oversight. And, kudos to all the ranches and the hunting outfits and all of those folks that, haven't pushed these animals to extinction or to local extirpation. But, the concern that I have that is shared by a lot of folks is, we're living in different times. And if you look at the land fragmentation that is occurring in South Texas or across Texas, but in South Texas in particular, where we have a population of mountain lions, the idea that this animal that has persisted in the past is going to continue to persist with population growth, with land fragmentation, with all these other challenges that are, that it's battling against, like that certainly can't be guaranteed. We should have some degree of monitoring and management just to ensure that this animal has a future. And, that I totally understand. Like if a mountain lion kills somebody's sheep and goats, like kill that cat, like by all means, totally. But to have a population, like we should continue to have a population of mountain lions. And I think most people in Texas agree with that. And I think that, because of the film and because some of our efforts and advocacy around, mountain lions and hopefully urging the state to put together a management plan, I'm optimistic that something will occur. Maybe not to like have any sort of regulatory authority on the cats, but at the very least having some type of monitoring protocol. Because if we see that for the next 10 years, there's 100 cats a year being harvested, well, that's really good data to know that like there's a lot of cats out there. Mm-hmm. But if, that number goes from 100 or 500 to 400 to 300 to 200 to 100 to 10, and there's also a lack of sightings and observations being done scientifically, then that indicates like, hey, we've got a serious problem. So yeah, I'm cautiously optimistic that something will happen with mountain lions in Texas in the next year or so.
Yeah. And Ohio and Texas are not that dissimilar in that both states are mostly private land, and there's very, more so in Texas, I believe. I mean, don't quote me on that, but you guys have a lot less public land. We have some, like the southern region of the state here is very much more loaded with public land than where I'm at. I mean, there's a few hundred acres up the road here, and that's pretty much it. But it's like, people have this fear of predatory animals, especially. I mean, from here in Ohio, I mean, we used to have black bears, we used to have rattlesnakes, we used to have wolf. I mean, we had all the animals that are normal predators in the United States, and like now we have none. There might be a few black bears in southern Ohio. They're up in northern Michigan. That's about the closest we can get. And I know Texas is having a similar thing with bears too. is it just human to be scared of predators in general? Because black bears are normally fairly docile. I mean, they're not really the demonized predators that people think of. I mean, I've had encounters in the wild with black bears many times, and I've never had an issue as long as you're like respectful of them. So I think it's a black bear especially is like a very misunderstood animal because they're just big raccoons, in my opinion.
Yeah, I mean, I think most predators are. I mean, if you look at what's really dangerous to you in your life, like mountain lions and bears and coyotes and wolves, like none of that should be a concern at all. Like if you want to be truly terrified of something, next time you step in your vehicle and voluntarily go faster than the fastest land mammal can run in a multi-ton steel torpedo loaded with, 30 gallons of highly explosive liquid, like that should scare the shit out of you.
Yeah, it does.
But it's not. But the idea of like a bear, if you've never seen one before, but you've heard, these scary bear stories and that kind of stuff. It's scary. I also think there's something just hardwired in the human brain and in the human mind that comes from our ancestors whenever they were legitimate prey from like saber-toothed cats and these big badass predators that we used to live with.
So I noticed that you've done a lot of your documentaries have a lot of like breadth to them. Like they're you have like a main kind of issue at heart, and then you chose very carefully species to focus on. And I really love that because a lot of stuff is very like singularly focused that I watch. And it's like one animal, we're going to do a 2-hour documentary on this one thing. And that's great. I love that too. Is that a choice you make, or is that just how your natural proclivity to like tell a story in that way? Because I always like seeing the way different people touch on very like in-depth topics like that, but you like yours is very broad, but very like you get your point across very well for having so much broadness to it is what I'm getting at, I guess. So is that like a choice, or is that just how you storytell naturally?
I'll be quite honest with you that Deep in the Heart was my first natural history film to write or direct. So the fact that it turned out good is kind of a surprise to both of us. The way I kind of like, I'm doing 2 natural history features right now, and then got a bunch of short films on conservation and agriculture. But for our natural history stuff, I like to have a diversity of not only different species, but to have, we should have some mountain lions, but we should also have some blind catfish. Mm-hmm. And we should also have a reptile, and we should have a bird, and just kind of show off all these different sorts of critters. And then also a variety of habitats as well, and kind of how they connect. But one of the things I look for is an animal that represents something, an animal and a behavior that represents something more than just a beautiful animal doing something interesting. Mm-hmm. And, an example of that is in Deep in the Heart, we had this beautiful sequence of alligator gar that had timed their spawn to where the river rose above the banks, and then they came out of the river, and then they went out and they laid their eggs in the floodplains. And then, the female went out and she was courted by like 6 or so males. I spawned. The eggs then were fertilized, and then they flowed back into the river as the floodwaters receded. It was just this really beautiful story, but it represents so much more than just a cool animal doing something interesting. It represents the natural function of how our East Texas rivers work, of how these species that live there, it's not just gar, it's all sorts of darters, it's all sorts of other fish. They kind of time their reproductive cycles with the ebbs and flows of the river. And the river isn't just the water that's inside of a channel. The river supplies the entire watershed, and the whole forest depends on it. And, whenever you contrast that natural river ecosystem and you kind of get connected to the gar and you get connected to that spawning event and you learn something new, you kind of place value on it. And then, in the next scene, whenever there's an explanation of how, our rivers have largely been dammed and diverted and controlled to such an extent where this natural function isn't able to occur, then the viewer thinks like, well, hot damn, like, man, that'd be cool if we could figure out a way to where it did occur, which is great. That's the whole point of the whole movie. And I think that's what I want. What I look for in a natural history sequence is a species and a behavior that represents more than just itself. Yeah. And that's kind of what we sought out with Deep in the Heart. Is like, the ocelot, they represent hope for endangered species. The bison, it's an example of a success story. That's kind of how we structure stuff, but I'd be lying to you if I told you we had it all figured out. We're learning as we go.
Yeah, that's making anything, I've come to find, because I started to try and dip my toes in that documentary world, and I made something. I was super stoked about it. My buddy who does a lot of work with National Geographic, I was like, dude, and then he just has this look on his face like, hey, you might want to try again. And I'm just like, oh, okay. But I mean, that's what it takes, man. He's like, it's good, but it's not like good that to the level you want it to be. And I think it's important to kind of take a step back and realize maybe you don't know what you're doing, especially me.
Well, man, don't be discouraged. Like keep going after it. And if you have a good story, it doesn't matter if it's shot, on a $50,000 red camera with a prime lens or a Canon Rebel. Like, if it's super engaging, the audience they don't care what it's shot on. And, the storytelling ability and being able to capture unique behavior, that's what I think really matters.
Well, I like that. The one scene where you guys get off your mountain bikes and it's like pouring rain and snow, and then it's all like GoPro running through the weeds and stuff. I was like, that's making a movie right there, dude. Yeah, I love that stuff. So as... everyone's different. Obviously, everybody feels different ways. So you interact with wildlife on a level that most people will never, ever, ever interact with them. I mean, through filmmaking, through observing, through incredibly rare species that most people will never even see in the wild. Do you have hope for the future? Because like when you get into conservation, it can be really depressing. Like just in general, you're just like, it feels like the world is like collapsing around you, but then you take a step back and like look at the big picture. So do you feel a lot of hope for the future? I mean, I know that's a really hard question to answer, but I don't know. I get stuck in these moments where I'm like, we can do this. And then I get stuck in these things where I'm just like, dude, what is going on? I'm absolutely like beat to death right now.
Yeah. I mean, I have two kids, one's 6 months old and one's 2.5. So I don't really have the choice of not having hope for the future.
It's true. Yeah, that's a good point. Yeah, it just gets so scary because it's, especially with wildlife, it's just like sometimes you feel like people don't care because it's not affecting them directly every day. And I think that's the part that worries me. I've made it my goal in life to be like, how can I make this interesting to people without it being like too over the top or like too, like, how can I get people to care? That's my hardest thing. And that's obviously an incredibly insane goal because not everyone will care. That's just the way of the world. But I don't know.
I think right now people probably care more about wildlife and a healthy planet than possibly ever before in the history of mankind. Mm-hmm. And that does give me hope. I think where people tend to where people tend to fail is whenever it comes down to like personal sacrifice. Mm-hmm. I know myself, like I could be a lot better at a lot of things and I'm not. But, everybody wants there to be, healthy rivers and healthy ecosystems and lots of wildlife. Like nobody doesn't want that. And that does give me hope. I think that for, some of the big magnificent species, those I hope are always gonna be around. Like it's pretty hard to like watch an animal like an ocelot just blink out from the United States. Like people are gonna rally around that. But I think that the scarier thing is the animals that are more ecosystem dependent, in which it's really hard to figure out how to like continue for them to have an existence. Stuff that you can't just do a reintroduction for and bring it back easily. A lot of your invertebrates, a lot of plant species that are being overwhelmed by invasives, a lot of your river mussels that their only chance of survival is to have a complete restructuring of the water policy and entire rivershed. Like, that's the kind of stuff that is really hard to save from extinction. And in our lifetimes, we're going to see a lot of extinction that is going to happen, and it is already happening. And, sadly, it's become so commonplace that I feel like it's kind of this thing that people kind of accept that isn't even worthy of press coverage. And that's really sad. But I think that the more, us as wildlife storytellers, I think the better we are at it, the more of us we are at it, and making stuff entertaining as well, because, whether we like it or not, we are in competition for people's time.
Yes, absolutely.
And if the same amount of care and devotion was placed into creating natural history films as it was on Avatar or the next Star Wars or the next whatever it was. I mean, if we also had $150 million budgets for just distribution alone, the general public would have so much better understanding of a lot of this stuff. And I mean, I can't really blame a lot of people for being ignorant on it. Like, if you grew up in a city and you didn't have any role models that took you outside, and then you got a job as an accountant for a firm and had a wonderful lifestyle, like, it's not your fault that you don't know, a lot of wildlife stuff. But I feel like those individuals still care. And, that gives me hope. And I do think it's cool to see more politicians, kind of carrying this policy or campaign promises of advocating for wildlife, especially those that are saying not only am I going to care about wildlife, but I'm going to care about it and reach across the aisle and find common ground. That's encouraging.
Yeah. Well, I know you have a hard deadline and I have 1,000 more questions, so I'm going to wrap it up there for you. I really appreciate your time. I know you're a busy man. You're doing good things for the world, man, getting people aware about wildlife. And I think that's just amazing. So I give you kudos for that. I mean, to me, that's everything. I wish more people were doing that. And there are people out there that are trying to do it. So thank you. Before you go, where can people find not only more about you, but your films and social media and stuff like that? If you're doing social media, I know it's a pain in the butt, but
yeah, so you can watch Deep in the Heart. It's on Apple TV, it's on Amazon Prime, Google Play. You can see all of our films at our website, finandfurfilms.com. You can see the trailers for some of the past stuff, as well as all of our short films. My name is Ben Masters. You can find me on Instagram and Facebook. I don't do the other platforms. And I hope to run across you and your fans in person one day and get to shake hands, talk about this stuff live.
All right, Ben. Thank you so much, man. Take it easy out there and keep making awesome films, man.